Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. Secretary of State Blinken visits China as Washington and Beijing continue high-level contacts to manage relations. North Korea claims to have conducted its first nuclear counterattack drills. Today we discuss geopolitics in Northeast Asia.
And indeed an obligation for the world to manage the relationship between our two countries responsibly.
We continue to consult closely with our allies in the Republic of Korea and Japan when it comes to regional security and stability issues.
In the studio with me, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was Senior Director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Wilder was CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Also joining us, Ms. Emma Chanlett-Avery, Political Security Affairs Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Previous to this post, she served for 20 years as a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where she focused on U.S. relations with Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Wilder, there is a strong argument in Washington that the United States should not just manage its competition with China, but win it. What would be the definition of winning this competition?
Let me start by saying that I am a devout Christian and a Republican, and for decades I have fought communism. I hate communism. I hate the things that have done in the name of communism in Xinjiang, Tibet, and now in Hong Kong. However, the idea that we are going to force regime change in China is both unworkable and unreasonable. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan trying to create regime change. We ended in defeat. Regime change is not an easy thing to do. And my biggest concern over this argument, which is among a very small group of individuals in Washington, and nobody has spoken out in support of their position on this of any stature that I know of, is are our allies willing to go to that endgame, to attempt to defeat the Chinese? The most sensible man in East Asia that I knew on this topic was Shinzo Abe. And Shinzo Abe talked about creating strength. He talked about shaping Chinese behavior. He talked about moving China in a responsible direction. But loose talk about regime change will only end us in a war with the Chinese. It is dangerous.
So those who say they gotta win the competition are actually going for regime change?
Absolutely. What does winning mean? It means what we did to the Soviet Union. China is not the Soviet Union. China is a powerful nation. 120 nations trade more with China than they do with us. The Soviet Union was a weak nation, a fragile nation. It actually collapsed from the inside. We are not going to collapse the Communist Party. The Communist Party is something we have to live with, and we have to learn to live with, whether, as I say, we like it or not, and I don't like it. The Chinese people deserve better than what they have today, but we cannot force that change.
Ms. Chanlett-Avery, what is your reaction to the criticism that the Biden administration's approach to China is too diplomatic and not from the position of force or strength?
I think that characterization, first of all, thank you for having me, but I think that is a combination of politics, as usual, as well as a real difference in opinion in how we deal with this sort of once-in-a-generation challenge. The Biden administration, I think, has been pretty clear that its purpose in sending all these high-level officials, Treasury Secretary Yellen, now Anthony Blinken, Dan Crittenbrink, the Assistant Secretary, went just about a week ago, is to stabilize this relationship and not get to the point where, I think back to the balloon incident, where it could have escalated into much more of a crisis, and we simply didn't have open lines of communication. So this is an attempt, I think, to manage the relationship, to agree where we can on smaller board issues, but also to make very clear where we stand on these major differences we have geopolitically, economically, over trade issues, for example.
And Professor Wilder, there's major concerns in the United States over China's nuclear and military capabilities. What are the ways for the United States to keep competitive edge in the area of technology and military equipment over China?
Well, first of all, we have the competitive edge. Our soldiers have been fighting for 20 years continuously. The Chinese have not fought a war since 1979. One Chinese general has combat experience from that war, and he will soon die. So when we talk about competitive edge, I teach on the Chinese military at Georgetown. I've studied the Chinese military since 1980. The Chinese military is derivative of our military. They stole the designs for the F-35 aircraft to create their J-20 aircraft. We do not need to worry about their nuclear force. We have a huge nuclear arsenal. Theirs will continue to be, yes, it's growing, but it will continue to be much smaller than our nuclear capability, and they know that. They know we're the gold standard.
But it is true that the pace of their expansion militarily, it is very fast in the recent years.
Yes, and there are areas that you can point to, like hypersonic weapons, where they may be ahead of us. But you have to look at overall capability. You have to look not only at weapon systems, which you're talking about, but the soft side of the military. I look at their training and I'm not impressed. When I see their aircraft carrier go out in the South China Sea, their ability to have sortie rates is very low compared to our carriers, the Ford-class carriers that have tremendous firepower and sortie rates. I'm not impressed yet with the Chinese military.
People also have concerns over Chinese Navy.
The Chinese Navy is big, but when did it ever fight? Name me one combat mission the Chinese Navy has ever had. It hasn't. These are inexperienced naval officers who have never been under fire, whereas the United States Navy, of course, has been under fire around the world, is right now under fire in the Red Sea. Do you see the Chinese out there defending ships? Why? They can't do it. They don't have the capabilities we have. So yes, they have a 300-ship Navy. Good for them. A lot of ships, but not capability.
Ms. Chanlett-Avery, on top of this battle to have superiority over trade, tech, and military, United States and China is also locked in a clash of values. How should the United States counter China's narrative and influence operations on the global stage?
I think the simple answer is that we need to live by the values that we espouse. We need to continue to stand up for human rights, for example, while also acknowledging the deficiencies in our own system. Our democracy has certainly not been perfect over the last several years. But I think that we need to not be too rigid in our criticism of governance. And I think particularly of Southeast Asia when I say that. These are the countries that are right there in China's backyard, that have very important trading and sometimes cultural relationships with the PRC. And all those countries have different systems, varying degrees of either authoritarianism or democracy. And I think that we need to be careful in drawing too dark of a line between the countries that we like and the countries that we don't like. And if we don't, we're going to continue to lose out in terms of influence in the region.
And Professor Wilder, it's been reported that among the China hawks in Washington, there's a division over how hard to fight China. Is this true?
Well, I'm a China hawk, and I have just told you that I have strong differences with other China hawks. Yes. The question of end state is a very important one. And it's one that, frankly, the Biden administration has done a very poor job of articulating. What world do we want in this conflict with China? Where do we want to be 20, 50 years down the line? In my view, we want to be much stronger than the Chinese, have secure alliances, have secure freedom of navigation around the world, but we don't have to destroy China to do that. We have to work from a position of strength. We have to shape Chinese behavior in the future, but we also have to live with China. This is the second most populous nation in the world. This is right now the second largest economy that could become the world's largest economy. The idea that somehow we are going to get rid of the Communist Party, that we are going to get rid of the differences with China, is fanciful.
Ms. Chanlett-Avery, how hard should the United States fight with China?
I think the United States needs to use all of the tools at its disposal to manage this relationship. I think that the Biden administration has been particularly effective at elevating our alliances. It's very much a foreign policy that's driven by the strength of the alliances, both the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific. And I think that a lot has been accomplished in terms of aligning our narratives with our allies and working in productive ways to be a more stabilizing force in the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Wilder, given that Taiwan is key to China dream, how should the United States and its allies, including South Korea, adjust their military and diplomatic strategies in light of the Taiwan contingency?
I am happy to see what President Yoon has done in terms of diplomatic strategy on the Taiwan question. I think it's very important to internationalize the Taiwan issue, not for it just to be an American issue with the Chinese, but Europe, the rest of East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, the more countries that we can get to shape Chinese behavior, the better off we'll be. Now, on the question of military, my view is that President Yoon and South Korea should appropriately be focused on the North Korean threat. That could be a surprise. We never know when Kim might move. And I do not want to see the South Koreans taking their eye off the ball. So I am not in favor of South Korea committing itself to the defense of Taiwan militarily. We can do that with Japan, Philippines, Australia, UK, other partners. I think that it is appropriate for the Korean people to focus on a very real imminent threat and not to engage too heavily on the Taiwan side militarily.
I do think that there's a tension there, though, right, in the alliance, in that I tend to agree with you. We should, the South Koreans should keep their eye on North Korea, but I think there's a concern that the United States, preoccupied with a possible contingency in the Taiwan Straits, isn't putting all its attention on the North, too.
Oh, I absolutely agree. In fact, I have criticized, and I continue to criticize, this administration for neglecting the North Korean problem.
So this is where the opinions diverge. Professor Wilder said that South Korea should focus on North Korea in Taiwan contingency. What are your thoughts?
Well, I do agree with Professor Wilder here that the South Korean security situation demands that they really remain laser focused on the threat from the North. Where I think the alliance has really strengthened, though, under Biden and Yoon, has been in sort of embracing a global value sort of package. The South Koreans have actually been very important in terms of the Ukraine situation. They have provided a lot of arms, for example, to Europeans whose stocks have been depleted by this conflict. So it's been, I think, there's been an internationalization of the alliance in ways that I think are fairly new to the U.S.-ROC relationship.
And I want both your opinions on this. Secretary Blinken again asked his Chinese counterpart to play constructive role in North Korean situation in the denuclearization and preventing North Korea from provocations. Now, will China heed such U.S. demands when it considers North Korea's success to be in its national interest?
There are no teeth behind these demands. We've asked this over and over again of the Chinese, but there are no consequences for the Chinese. We haven't sanctioned Chinese banks involved in North Korean trade. We haven't called the Chinese out on the fact, I understand there is a ship from Russia now in China carrying North Korean arms to Russia. Is the administration asking about that? I think there's negligence here. And I also think that the strongest case the U.S. can make is not, we need your help, but this is in your own interest. If we do not get the Chinese to do something on this issue, I am convinced at some point the South Korean people will decide they have to go nuclear. If the South Korean people decide they have to go nuclear, the Japanese will. If the Japanese will, Taiwan will be not far behind. Does China want a proliferation of U.S. allies with nuclear weapons? I hardly think that's in the Chinese security interest.
I want to agree with one part of what Professor Wild said and take a little bit of a different approach on something else. Definitely agree that there is a desire by the South Korean people to go nuclear. I think that the Washington Declaration that was signed between Biden and Yoon was really a matter of buying time more than anything else, which is worth it. It's worth it to buy that time. Sure. I agree that a nuclear arms race could break out if we saw that happen, and that's dangerous to the region and very destabilizing. But I think that the Chinese strategic interest in North Korea sort of remains consistent over the years. They don't want that to be a destabilizing force in the region. They don't want to see the flow of refugees over the border. But the geopolitical situation has changed. Russia now has a more meaningful relationship with Pyongyang. North Korea suddenly has some leverage because they have something that Russia needs, the munitions needed to carry out the war in Ukraine. So I think that Beijing probably is not terribly happy with that development, despite the fact that China and Russia have been more aligned and have worked cooperatively. I think that Beijing really likes to be the ultimate arbiter of what happens in Pyongyang.
Now I want to delve into geopolitics in Northeast Asia more. Professor Wilder, how might the alignment between Russia and North Korea that you just mentioned, especially the military equipment transfer, and especially the concern that Russia may give high-tech military technology to North Korea, how would that change the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula in the future?
Well, I have to be honest with you, we don't know, because we don't know what agreements Putin made with Kim. This is a huge intelligence failure right now. I hope the administration is trying to correct that intelligence failure, because if you look at the range of things that the Russians could do for the North Koreans, it is very scary. Imagine a North Korea with a real ballistic missile submarine, or a fleet of 4 or 5 ballistic missile submarines, sailing the Pacific, being able to threaten the west coast of the United States. That is possible because the Russians have incredibly good ballistic missile submarines. 2,000 nuclear tests conducted by the Soviet Union. That kind of data would allow the North Koreans to create a sophisticated tactical nuclear weapon without any testing. So the range of things have monumental implications for the military situation in East Asia. But the simple fact is we don't know.
And if we look at the regional implications, how would the North Korea-Russia alignment impact the regional stability, and how should the international community respond to that?
Well, obviously this has shifted the geopolitical sense in the region. It reinforces this sense that we're forming into these strategic blocks right now. I mean, the sort of irony of this, though, is that when North Korea misbehaves and is not negotiating, it drives closer trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. It's like the gift that keeps giving in terms of developing that relationship. Where it gets harder is if North Korea actually decides to negotiate, because we have different priorities coming to those negotiations. But right now, it seems to be casting its lot with Russia and with China. And that tends to reinforce the divisions and get us further and further from negotiation.
And Ms. Chanlett-Avery, in Washington, deeper U.S., South Korea, Japan cooperation coming on the heels of warming of ties between Seoul and Tokyo is considered one of Biden administration's biggest diplomatic achievements. But military exchanges and cooperation with Japan is still a very sensitive issue in South Korea. Do you think there's a gap in the perception of how U.S. views the South Korea-Japan relationship and how people in South Korea view the Japan and South Korea relationship? And even if you institutionalize the trilateral cooperation, wouldn't it easily erode if any of the governments change in the next elections?
First, I want to say I think that this trilateral partnership is tremendously important. I think it is probably the most stabilizing thing that can happen in terms of U.S. leadership in the region. I very much agree that it's delicate right now. It is based on these three particular leaders being willing to be courageous. I would give President Yoon probably the greatest credit in terms of his political courageousness in reaching out. I think that the institutionalization of this partnership is important. I think there are a lot of efforts to bake it in as much as possible right now. And I do think it makes it a little bit harder to back away from those high-level engagements, but certainly not impossible. I think that if a leader in any of the three capitals came in that saw that they could score important political points, then there's nothing to stop them from backing out of all of those arrangements. So I think that to the extent that particularly Seoul and Tokyo can engage bilaterally in a productive way, even if the United States is not carefully managing that relationship, would be the best possible outcome of this trilateral arrangement.
Professor Wilder, President Yoon has actively participated in military cooperation with the United States and Japan, and this is a stark contrast from the previous Moon administration, which played in the middle between Beijing and Washington. However, there are concerns in Korea that South Korea's top priority is deterring North Korean threat, whereas Japan and US's strategic challenge, biggest one, comes from China. So their concern is that if President Yoon and the South Korean government focus too much on the diplomatic and military cooperation with the United States and Japan, that would harm South Korea's own national interest. How would you respond to that concern?
Frankly, South Korean government has to do both. I would not worry about our commitment. We have 27,500 young Americans. I know some of those young Americans on the peninsula, protecting the peninsula. The Biden administration has done a good job of reassuring on the extended deterrent and bringing the South Koreans more into that. But at the same time, South Korea's economic interests do lie with China to a certain extent. They have to create some sort of relationship with this neighbor. Their situation is very different from our situation. We have a Pacific Ocean protecting us. They don't have that. So I think it's a balancing act for South Korea, and South Koreans have to decide the weight they give to these different factors. I think that the Yoon government has done a good job of standing up to Beijing because, frankly, Beijing respects strength, not weakness. And I think past South Korean governments gave the Chinese a sense that they were weak and could be manipulated and used. So I think South Koreans have to be tough in the face of the Chinese. But I think they can do both.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ms. Chanlett-Avery, Professor Wilder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.